for inviting me, David. Okay, let's do it again. Hi, thank you very much for inviting me, David, and thank you very much for coming also to those recording online. So I want to talk to you a bit about work we've been doing in the bigger topic context of what we call human-in-the-loop reinforcement learning. And I got a hint from David that the audience may be a bit broader. So I had a much more technical talk that is sort of now wedged in between and condensed, and there's going to be slide skipping to allow some broader things to be shared. I make that for accessibility. I've not rehearsed that because literally we've done this roughly half an hour ago, this switch. So if you have technical questions, do ask me. Maybe we do it best uses online, offline, but do ask the questions. But also there are, of course, some bigger questions. And as all talks on this beautiful topic of artificial intelligence, we need to say, what is AI? And AI is what people do on PowerPoints, and machine learning is what people do in Python. That's what I usually say. But actually, AI is a question. How do we build systems that solve problems for which humans need intelligence? The dominant solution at the moment is machine learning. And I think probably also the only solution at the core. And if you need to machine learn, you need data. And that's why we're talking also about data science in this theme complex. If we're thinking about how do we solve problems intelligently, David Marr in the 70s gave us some beautiful inspiration how to think about that. He basically says, at the top level, we're thinking about a solution strategy. How should I solve a problem? And here I'm declaring my flags of showing Bayes' theorem. Then there's the next challenge. Once you have a solution strategy, how do you calculate and represent the solution strategy? So that's what we call the algorithmic level. And only at the very end are we asking, how do we implement the system in hardware, in specific lines of code, and if it's a biological system, in wetware? Because up to here, the questions are irrelevant, whether it's neuroscience, cognitive science, computer science, or engineering. And it's only here when you have an actual implementation that you need to start thinking, what is actually the thing I run that on? And this thinking is very pervasive in computational neuroscience. And sort of a lot of my time we spent thinking here, what are the calculation representations that we need for a good solution? And how much of that can take inspiration from the brain, and vice versa, how much can we take of the formalisms from computer science, statistics, and engineering to help answer these questions in forms of problems of neuroscience. And so really from here, you get the pressure at the top level from normative theories. How should I do inference? How should I approach a certain problems? And from here, you get constraints that come from the real world. You know, you have a brain made of proteins, fat, and salty water cables, right? We call them axons. How do you build a brain like that is reliable? And so these constraints squeeze together and basically shape and influence how we deal with these calculation representations. And so that's basically the philosophy about how we're thinking in the lab. So it's very neuroscience in some way. However, what we're applying ourselves to is to think about solutions in artificial intelligence for healthcare. And AI for healthcare has become a very standing keyword these days. What I like to say is that AI for healthcare contains all the challenges that make machine learning a hard problem. You need to deal with uncertainty. You need to deal with a lot of data. You need to deal with not enough data. You need to deal with many different constraints around explainability. How do you make sure that the system is safe? So a lot of things that make machine learning a hard, interesting problem are contained within AI for healthcare problems. And the bonus is you're helping people beyond, just making more money or something like that. And the challenges here when we're talking about machine learning AI applications in society is that often people are then concerned, oh, you're taking jobs away. You meant to make the doctors, nurse unemployed. And that's very much not the case. What's actually happening is, this is US data, but it applies almost in every industrialized and new industrializing world, is that the supply for clinicians, so doctors, nurses, therapists, and so forth, is vastly outstripped by the demand that's simply rising from a rapidly growing population and then rapid aging, and then sometimes you get a pandemic thrown in the mix. So basically, you have simply unmet demand that you can't simply meet with the people. Even if everyone gets a job, and they often do, there's unmet demand. So what we're trying to do with AI and machine learning in this space, we're trying to reduce the unmet demand. So we really think this is AI for social good in that sense. It's really not about making people redundant. It's lightening their workload so they're not just quitting in desperation. Okay, and of course we've seen many examples of AI in healthcare over the past few years that were very prominent. And I'm going to use here a term that comes from my definition of AI. Remember, AI is about solving problems that humans can solve through intelligence. And one type of problems is what we call perceptual problems. Recognizing your face, recognizing your voice is something that my perceptual apparatus does. So when a doctor recognizes a brain tumor in a scan, when your phone recognizes your voice, these are all perceptual solutions. And these days we can solve them, if you have enough data, very efficiently with deep learning. And effectively, you're making a single decision, either for a number, then we call it regression, or for a label, and then we call it classification. And so typically you have some operational environment, equipment, business, something that gives you data about situation sensors. You have a decision maker or an operator that they take a single decision or action or gives you a number. And in healthcare, this has been extremely successful because the digitization of the healthcare sector is very much progressed simply due to the work pressures. And especially in Britain, we are in a very globally unique situation that I can talk to you more about separately. But you're seeing that there's a whole range of perceptual AI systems, and these are all systems that are listed that outperform not only single doctors or the average doctors, but even teams of doctors who conferring about the diagnosis. So for example, we can now recognize skin cancer from a photograph that in theory you can take with your mobile phone much more accurately, as accurately almost as a biopsy skin sample, outperforming teams of doctors, of screen dermatologists. And it's just a list of papers. Here you see simply how partially large the numbers are, and here you see how good the area of the curve is. And if you think this is not a good AOC, then I should point out that probably doctors are at the lower level. Just to give you a sense, when people say my image recognition algorithm doesn't recognize a cup with 99.9%, well, in medicine it looks a bit different. And it's all perceptual tasks. It's not just visual tasks, it can be hearing, listening to your lung if you have COVID or not, or finding tooth decay by how your haptic feedback looks like. So these are all perceptual decisions. Most of what we do as humans is not just about the perception, it's about the perception learning action loop that we have. Maybe this loop that's constantly operating, where you're seeing something, making a decision about it, adapting to the situation, and then formulating an action. You don't just do that one, you do that continuously, right? And so if you do continuous decision making, we speak about control if you're an engineer, and if you're in a system where you don't know the system exactly, and so you don't know what you're controlling, you don't know how to achieve a certain control solution, then we speak about reinforcement learning in this context. And this natural language for dealing with these perception action learning loops, we get from machine learning, namely from reinforcement learning, which brings us to the good old Markov decision process, where the idea is that you have an agent that learns from interaction. So they issue an action labeled here A that somehow affects the world, and that the world then updates the agent with a change of state that may have occurred and a reward that you collect. This is the standard NDP formulation that we've been studying for the past 40, 50 years. We've become more sophisticated in thinking about that, but maybe you have, to speak effectively, some form of decision tree where the state of an action leads to a certain reward that you're collecting, and the aim is that you find decisions, what action to pick in what certain state you are, so as to maximize a form of long-term reward. And of course, we can also frame this in terms of a probabilistic graphical model, where we can say what actions are true. Well, that's conditioned on the states that I've been in. If I want to maximize this reward, then it depends upon my state, my action, and my successor, and then it gives me an immediate reward, and to somehow integrate that, or I want to maximize that. And of course, being in London, we don't need to list the many successful examples of how MVP theory has been used. The basic idea is that you're looking at state action pairs, assign some form of value function to that, and the goal is here to maximize the long-term value. And this works very well, especially at the level of, for example, playing video games, as we know for a bunch of years now. where you take an image, you have some form of supervised learner or a deep learning network here, a convolutional neural network that learns to represent the state, and you're linking that and mapping that to possible actions that you have. And what you want to train this network to is to pick actions given the state that give you high rewards. And the rest is history. I'm not going to repeat all of reinforcement. But I don't want to talk to you about reinforcement learning for playing video games, StarCraft, whatever came out. I want to talk to you about human skills. And so let's switch tack. So when a doctor diagnoses you with, you have hemorrhoids, they've done a perceptual decision and then told you this is the case. But that's just the start of your journey as a patient because you want to get better. And so this means it's about agency. It's not about just analyzing the data. It's understanding what to do. So a doctor needs to plan, manage, and adjust what they're doing to how your disease evolves. So the equivalent setting here is that you have now a closed loop setting between equipment, environment, and business, somebody that gives you information, and a decision maker or an operator then issues an action. And so actions have consequences, and so you need to account for this fact. And that's, of course, naturally handled by this MDP framework. And just to shape a bit about where we see reinforcement learning example, it's not just self-driving cars. We will see that increasingly in ships, for example, where you have sequential decision making, where, for example, high-level decisions can be very easily taken by an agent, an AI system. But then all the low-level things, rudder hard left or machines full stop, they can be actually done by humans. So you may have a setting where basically the high-level strategy of how to set course is done by a machine that instructs humans what to do. Another example where you have this type of skill is in surgery. You need to get to the tumor, so you need to choose. Maybe there's an aneurysm, and then you need to do something else. So this is another example for this interactive loop of decision making. And of course, the Holy Grail is who is so good that he knows what you need before you even know that, and can issue actions according to that to maximize your long-term happiness. And so here we're really talking about what I call cognitive skills, because you need to plan, you need to manage, and that you need to adjust your plans, right? Okay, we can map this all to video games, but I hope phrasing it like that gives you a different appreciation of what we can use reinforcement learning for. So this is really, that brings us to what I call human expert. A doctor is more than just a machine that recognizes a skin cancer. A doctor knows what to do and can adjust to what they're doing depending on how the treatment goes. And so we're really getting into something that we call the archetypes of thinking about human and AI systems in interaction. So the classic setting, I always pick the doctor setting here, is that it's a human doing something to another human, a doctor prescribing a drug, and then you observe, is the patient getting better or not? And if they die, that's really bad, so you get a negative reward. You can, of course, think about agents and artificial systems, systems playing video games on their own, so video game AI. You can think about where a human instructs a machine to do something, and then the machine basically adapts to that and executes something. Or as an example of the ship control, or as you will see in certain companies that have very large warehouses, you have agents that instruct humans to do things, and you observe how the humans are acting in this space. And so what we're interested in is this loop here, this sort of the character type role and the patient cared for type role and these interactions. And this is something we've worked on for quite a while. So in 2013, for example, we started looking at how can we manage diabetes through reinforcement learning. And the idea here is that if you have diabetes, you have a damaged pancreas, and each pancreas damage is very specific. So if I can learn from dosing of insulin, how good you can adjust your sugar levels in your blood, I can learn not only is healthier than, say, if you follow the standard approach where every time you go for lunch or eat a cake, you inject yourself with huge doses. And actually, this we didn't do in humans. This was work that we did with animals that had to speak and were hooked up to an insulin pump, and they could go about their day. We actually learned a control strategy that uses less insulin and basically kept the degree of of diabetes titering these patients. And we gave this to this company, and they may or may not be doing something with it. We then looked at the same thing for surgery. Again, big challenge in surgery, you need to be under, you don't want to feel pain. But if I put you too much under, it will take you much longer to recover, or you may not wake up. So you need to adjust to that. And the challenge is different tissues of your body absorb different amounts of this propofol. That's what puts you under. And again, it's very hard for an anesthesiologist to determine how much propofol is actually in your brain. And so we built a reinforcement learning system. This was a continuous actor critic type model that used a brain signal from brain waves that tell us something about your level of consciousness, and could, during the surgery, adjust the level of propofol. And this is all fine. This we did in silico because there was an FDA-approved in silico model. But it's very hard to take this straight to a patient. Oh, I actually want to deploy this in a surgery. So we look for problems where we can actually deploy that in a more meaningful way. So these people I'm showing you here are all paralyzed below or from the hip downward. So they cannot actually move their legs. But what's very helpful for these people is they can actually cycle, because they get cardio exercise. Your legs are fantastic pumps that keep you healthy. And you can say that for paraplegic people, being able to do that is really life lengthening by up to 10 years. And so here you see a competition, an international competition that we ran during the lockdowns, where we had teams all over the world, 65 teams competing. And basically what you do is you stimulate the muscles of these people. So you treat the muscles like robotic actuators. And now you basically need to electrically find the right stimulus so these people can cycle. And so we built here again a reinforcement learning system, and I need to jump to the right place to see where we're winning this race and get a silver medal. That's us, in our pilot, Johnny Beer, where we can dynamically adjust to how the muscle fatigue goes, how he gets more tired, and we have a reinforcement learning agent that can in real time adjust to that. And that's great and wonderful, but there's a problem. And the problem ultimately lies in the fact that we're doing it interactively, because you cannot do that much wrong when you let system stimulate. If you stimulate it wrong, you block the legs. Of course, you have limits that you don't electrocute the person, but there's a limitation. So what we actually wanted to look for, so the examples I've shown you, so this one here that I call the Ironman model is where you have, where you, so to speak, have a human agent and that basically instructs the robot agent to do something, right? I want to race very fast, and then the robot actually acts on the world. And so this is a loop of reinforcement learning where you have a human high-level agent and a world agent acting in parallel to each other. You can think about the setting where a human is more, just their advisor. It tells an agent to do something, and then the system needs to execute that. And so these actions are optional. You can ignore them. And so that's a bit like lane keep assist on the motorway. You say you want to overtake, and the car overtakes for you, or the ship captain says, I want to there, and the machine does the rest. But what we want to look at is settings in healthcare, where we have a human who needs to carry out the decision, where they need to make the cut with the surgical knife, where they need to prescribe a drug. But you have now an AI agent that makes a recommendation. I would do this because it's better for the long-term reward. And the system can only learn what the human actually did after you made the recommendation. And you then learn from how the world responded to that, whether it was valuable or not. So this is something we're focusing on. And this, interestingly, allows us to shift from a mode of operation where we're thinking about interaction to a mode of operation where we can systematically exploit operational data. So what happened in the past? We're talking here about off-policy estimation and reinforcement learning. Off-policy because we are not in control of the system. It already happened in the past, but we still want to learn what a good policy is. And so this brings us to what we call by now the AI Clinician Program. It's a fantastic team of collaborators. I've just thrown them all on the wall. It's an AI system that helps doctors treat patients in intensive care units. You can think about it as a semi-autonomous system because it makes treatment recommendation in real time, and the doctors need to adjust to that or can adjust to that. And it's grown beyond a just reinforcement learning project. We have multiple intensive care units involved. improving here at UCL. We have people who do safety critical system and human factors, and we're right now deploying it in 4 intensive care units. And I want to give you a bit of a flavor of that journey. So intensive care units are very interesting because you get tons of digital data of the state of the patient, a ridiculous amount. And interestingly, the clinicians are all aware of that, but they don't know how to make use of that. And another thing is, because ICUs are very fast-paced environments, actually, a lot of things happen in a very short amount of time. For legal purposes, the NHS is collecting and storing every single thing that a doctor or a nurse does to a patient. So we have state and we have action. So we have perception and we have action. And so effectively, what we're building now is a cognitive model, so to speak, of the clinician that wants to do something. This is a robot controller that sees the world and decides what to do with the arm. This is a doctor controller that sees a patient and decides what treatments to apply. And so we applied that to something that's called sepsis. So sepsis is the biggest killer of people in hospitals. It's systemic infection that leads to basically global shutdown of the infection. So you can treat it with antibiotics. That's the good news. The bad news is that your whole system, the cardiovascular respiratory system, shuts down before the antibiotics can manage that. So you need to think in some way about how to keep the people long enough alive. And you've basically dramatically simplifying that. So all ICU people looking at this, please forgive me. You can basically turn the knob about how much water you pump into the system, so you get the volume up, or how much vasoconstrictors or vasopressors you get. These are drugs that make your blood vessels narrow. So somehow you need to keep the blood flowing and the blood pressure right, that all the functions work. And a lot of people die from that. We have over 31 million cases of sepsis a year, 90 million are severe, and 5 million lives are claimed annually for it. So it's a big, big killer in hospitals. And every person who dies in ICU from COVID dies from sepsis, because that's what COVID leads to. Okay, just to give you a bit of a calibration in that space. And so basically, this all was kicked off by a project we started in 2015 and had a bit of visibility in the right moment to get the follow-on funding. And the basic idea is this. We have a system that observes the state of a patient in ICU, and then at the moment in time, it makes a decision, okay, keep the amount of liquids, we call them IV fluids, constant, and 30 minutes later decides, oh no, to keep the patient alive, we need to push up the IV fluids or do nothing or reduce the vasopressor dose. So we need to really manage different drugs or turn different knobs. And to try to explain why that's a challenge is, it's a very complicated system. It's not, there's a broken leg and I can see the bone is not connected. It's unclear what the state of the patient is. There have been many trials and studies for intensive care patients to understand what's going on. Because sepsis is systemic. It's not your eye that's damaged. It's all over the place and things are happening. So it's a very complex and murky state space. So basically, what we want to do is the following. I'm using here a grid world. Forgive me for those who have lost someone due to sepsis. The idea is the following. A patient contracts sepsis, and what we want to do is we want to make sure that this patient survives for 90 days after they've been released from ICU. If you do that, we simply issue you a reward of +100. If the patient dies within the 90 days, either in the ICU or after leaving ICU, then we issue a negative reward. Right? So that's the reward function we set. And now the system needs to work out, this is the classic grid world, what are the different playing fields a patient can move to? And then you need to work out what are the controls? How do I get from here to here? What combination of drug dosages or changes get me from here to here? So, in a simple world, you can see the problem and I need to go up and I need to go right. The problem is you don't know what these boxes are. And you don't know how to realize these arrows. You don't know the representation. Of course, if I present it like you can solve it. It's a dynamical program problem, but already when I introduce things like that, for example, the patient had a heart attack, so you cannot access certain regions of the state space anymore. You cannot just minimize the distance. You need to think about a strategy that can back up and find adjust the treatment plan, manage. This is really all reinforcement learning 101, but it's just trying to translate that to their setting. So one thing we could do, and I'm just showing you a visualization, we can take patient data and try to visualize that patient data by defining states or meta states. And what you're seeing here is just the 2D principal Coleman projections of assuming that all the patients we had in the database of 60,000 patients, so we have the complete time series of that we know whether they died or not. We color coded each dot basically by the likelihood that a patient touching the state would survive or die. And we effectively just clustered the state space very naively. And what you're finding here is this count dot, each dot is the state, and then I'm showing you here a journey of a patient. So this patient here enters ICU, moves around here between these states, and then dies. This patient enters ICU, moves between these states, and then survives. This is not a Markov reward process, it's a Markov decision process. So there were actions done onto that patient. So some of these movements may simply be because the patient's disease evolved. Some of these actions actually resulted because doctors took actions. And so basically what we want to do is we want to learn from these state action pairs that were good, find basically the best practice for all possible patients. And people were skeptical that this would actually give anything meaningful. We could start already by showing people that we can live track the probability of survival of these people, how likely to die or survive, so at which moment it became to be clear when this happened, and learn an optimal policy. And again, the policy here is a combination of multiple drug dosages over time, difficult to visualize. So what we can do, we can show you here on the retrospective hospital data, and how many patients survived. We've done it the following way. We had a database, publicly available, free, collected in the US by a co-author of ours of intensive care data, and we trained the system on that, and adjusted the high parameters. And then we had access to a second database of 3 million patients by one of the intensive care manufacturers, on which we then evaluated how good the model. So it's very different database, different hospitals. If there's anything working, let's see. So what we can then do, and this is all retrospective, we can go back in time and look at, okay, when the human doctors gave more than our reinforcement learning agent was giving on average of the trajectory for that patient of the IV fluids, then we could find that the mortality of the patient goes up. And if they exactly agreed all the time, then the mortality of the patient was low. It will not be zero because some patients die no matter what. Yeah? Enter ICU with refractory attached, you can do nothing as an agent to do that. And suddenly, if you change the dosage, the mortality shoots up. I'll get back to this. This is another drug, this vasopressor that I mentioned earlier. It's more dramatic. So if human and AI systems disagree, then the mortality rate shoots up. And this is over, a lot of patients that we calculated that. And then we found this weird thing here. It looks like you can underdose, this is milliliters, by up to 1 liter, and the mortality doesn't change. It's like, shit, the agent doesn't learn anything. And then my wonderful intensive care colleagues said, no, Aldo, they just published a clinical trial where they just tried to give a liter less, called the random trial, capital letters. And they showed you can dose 1 liter less and it doesn't affect the mortality of the patient. And that's very interesting because we got that information out of operational hospital data. We didn't need to run a clinical trial for that. To be very clear, I'm not saying that we shouldn't run clinical trials, but this is a very interesting way of learning policies that are treatment guidelines effectively. And then we can say, okay, why don't we test that if we didn't know that in a clinical trial? So we can guide a lot more what we're doing. Just to give you another flavor, this is all still 2018, 2019. We then looked at, given that a doctor for a specific patient-specific state took a certain decision, can we basically do Sharp value? So what is the meaning or the importance of certain features in the 60-dimensional feature vector that describes the patient current physiological state, and correlate that with the decision. And what you're seeing here is that the PF ratio, this feature here, it's a number, is very, very important in the clinician's decision, and others less so. And then we look what the optimal policy does in similar states. And so we, again, this averages over all the states, and find that there's not only fewer high the weighting is more uniform, and there's a different order where this feature is only third. And that's interesting. And so what you really see here from is that the user seems to focus on something specific. This is something that the textbooks train you on. Well, here you see a different order and different meanings. If you then look at the vasopressors, that other drug that we've looked at, then you see here that the clinicians base it effectively on 4 numbers. But the AI systems policy bases on a lot more numbers that it's integrated. And that has much to do with guidelines, that how they teach you that the smash ratio is important, but it also has to do with a very high pressure environment. And if you need to make a life or death decision, and I confront you with 60 numbers, time series of 60 numbers, you're not going to look at all these numbers in the 2-minute time window that you have time to make a call. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about that. But now we wanted to take this not just as an exercise of reinforcement learning. If you really want to build a semi-autonomous system that operates, we need to deal with a whole bunch of things. And what you're going to see now is that almost down to everything is something that we published last year. And that was, so to speak, the technical part of the talk. So the first challenge that you need to deal with is that sensor data is not complete. Only because I know your blood pressure and heart rate doesn't tell me that I know exactly how the disease looks in your body. So we need to deal with what we call partial observability. The benefit of that, we can use patient trajectory in history. So instead of a Markov decision process, we need to work with partially observable Markov decision processes. We may want to think about being able to do active learning. Is the patient in this state or not? I can't tell that from the data I have. But if I give him a bit more oxygen, maybe he perks up. So the system needs to be able to nudge the patient in some way. So we need to think about being able to support active learning. And ultimately, you will need to be able to quantify uncertainty. Do I just don't have enough data for the system to make a good recommendation? Or is maybe the outcome random, right? Because you don't know, the patient could go either way. We also need to deal with this sort of minor thing, improve the efficiency of the inference computations for POMDPs because they're very ruinous compared to MDPs. So we also need explainability, because remember, the action that comes from the reinforcement learner tells the AI, tells the doctor, hey, do this, and they will ask why, right? So how can we think about that explainability aspect? We need to quantify the uncertainty. I mentioned that. That's actually a redundant slide. And so the answer to this was for us to think about a system that can deal with partial observability, that can deal with uncertainties in a natural way, and has a natural way for defining what actions are the most informative for me to learn more about the state of the system and the policy that I don't know. And so this means we needed, and it needed to be continuous, of course, because drug dosages are continuous, and it needs to work in continuous time as well. So in reinforcement learning from robotics, the classic idea here is policy gradients. And of course, these days we do policy gradients with deep learning extension. But what we needed to do is make it fully Bayesian RL, and we need to be distributional. I will get back to that. So that's because we want to be able to handle in a naturally and consistent way uncertainty across the entire pipeline. We just don't want to know the uncertainty of the parameters. We want to know the uncertainty in the reward as well. And so we need to be able to represent that. And here I will now need to heavily skip slides. So the first step for that is that we go from a formulation of reinforcement learning strategy at the start, where you maximize an expected reward, where you're operating on distributions of rewards. So that what you're looking at is the full distribution of rewards that we're getting. And this is not work by us. That's, of course, Beautiful work that came out of DeepMind, where you're going from a simple operation operator that you're operating basically with distributional Bellman operators. And we'll not have the time now to cover that. And we'll skip a lot of that. So this is just background. Forgive me for that. Again, I would have introduced that in more time on a more technical talk. So basically, key solutions, I'm going to skip most of this, actually given the time, is that we want an algorithm that can learn these structures. And we needed to make a bunch of, include a number of things. So first of all, we used an adversarial training technique with a variational autoencoder to handle the POM-DP part. Remember, the POM-DP says you cannot directly observe the state, you need to infer the state, so to speak, from the history of the data. And so we needed something that can soak that up. And we soaked that up with a probabilistic, deprobabilistic model. And the second thing is we needed to basically find some formulations. Let's keep it superficial. That allowed us to handle this probabilistic updates in the state and observations in the framework of distributional reinforcement learning and the operations. So we needed to prove two theorems that allowed us that. And okay, well, let's look at videos. Fine. So these are standard Atari videos. We can play Atari games with that. But the interesting thing is, if you have now a system that represents the total uncertainty that you have in the parameters and the distribution of the reward. So a patient that may either live or die either way will have a large entropy in its reward distribution. A patient that always survive will have a very narrow entropy. So because we were able to maintain a fully Bayesian pipeline, we can actually directly evaluate the posteriors and measure for surprise or uncertainty. And so we can now do what we call curiosity-based exploration based on this posterior variance or the entropy of the posterior, whatever you want. What we're showing you here is for another favorite, we can show you here the continuous tracking of the estimated return. And then we have pulses here that tell you when this exploration uncertainty was high and overshot, because in this system, the agent did not know about what would happen if you ran into these pixels, because these were bad pixels, not good pixels. Okay, then these are standard learning curves. So the cool thing is you can outperform a whole range of distributional reinforcement learning algorithms that were already developed over the past 3 years. And we can also beat them up very often in the exploration space. Just keep skipping. We can do that for robots as well. I'll skip the benefits of being Bayesian. David can tell you everything about that. So I'm very sorry, this is a brutal simplification. So basically what we introduced with this EDG is a fully inference generative approach to distributional RL. And because we're fully Bayesian, we can derive a proper uncertainty-driven curiosity mechanism. Okay, and that leads us to the next problem. I have 5 minutes, right, or so? Yeah. So one box that we ticked is the following. Well, it's not really ticked, and I'm almost at the end. The idea is we have now an AI, and it shows, oh, this is the patient data, do this and this to the patient, and we have the clinician, and then they need to carry it out or ignore you and do something. Now, the clinician may have two questions about it. One is, well, what is the aleatoric uncertainty? Alias in Latin word for dice. So how random is it? You know, sometimes you do something and it can go either way. There's no way to know. And the other is, how uncertain are we because my model does not know? Either the model is poor, or we don't have enough data, or we haven't trained enough. Can we try to decompose these two uncertainties in our model? Can we learn the randomness, and can we get a sense of the model percentage uncertainty? Because that would be very good to show to the clinician, saying, look, I recommended this, it can go either way. Which is a very different answer from, I actually don't know. Why don't you decide, right? And so the interesting thing is, because we have this fully Bayesian representation, what I call this curiosity bonus and exploration is effectively a summary of the epistemic uncertainty of the model that we can exploit here. While you can take the aleatoric uncertainty, and I make it here a very simplified way, you can subtract the epistemic uncertainty from the reward distribution, and quote, quote, what is left should be the aleatoric uncertainty. Unfortunately, it's not as easy, and we're still trying to work out the exact solution. If you didn't do it on simple grid worlds, it's not a simple sum. It's a bit trickier to decompose. But the other thing is explanation. And here I had a very simple question. You know, you all have heard about explainable AI and how important that is. And, you know, interesting, it's mainly computer scientists who come up with ways of explaining things in a computer science way. But actually, it's not about computer science, it's about how you think about that, and you think about that, and you think about that. So what we realized is that none of these approaches can really tell me how to do that. We invented the way of basically doing a form of hierarchical reinforcement learning where the goals are hierarchical, because we had the idea, or maybe explaining what it needs to do is, how do we make a cup of coffee? Is, well, first you get the cup, and then you put the coffee in the machine, and then you press the button. If I can break down what you need to do in these chunks of explanation, that's good. And so we did this as a robotics paper and showed that you can basically learn a hierarchical set of goals that are independent of each other. But actually, it looks fine as a robot video. I can show you if you want. But the more basic question was this: will actually people follow if I give them an explanation? Because if you don't believe in AI, whatever the system says, you will ignore it. And so this brings me to my last 3 slides. So this is something that we call the trust shift paradigm. It's a very general paradigm, not just for our RL system, for any form of explainable AI, that we just didn't find a good answer to. So I'm showing you here an example. So we put this on Amazon Turk and trying to get 1,000 people by the end of this month to do this task. I'm showing you a snapshot of the results. We show you a photograph of a person. In this case, it's a GAN-generated face, so it's not a real human. We're actually showing real humans, for which we know the age from some celebrity database, for example. And we ask you a question: how old is this person? And we do it the following way. We show you the photo, we ask you, what do you predict? How old is the person? We say, oh, the person is this old. And then I tell you, okay, this is an AI that's going to assist you, sir, or ma'am. And the AI says this person is this old. And then we ask you again, so what is your final prediction? So you can say, no, I stick to what I do. I say, I forget the AI, it's actually younger, I go the opposite side. Or, you shift in the direction towards the AI, maybe it's older, or you even overshoot. But the key thing is, how much do you change your decision after you've been exposed to the AI? And that can be exposing it just to the AI. It can be the AI plus any mode of explanation you can invent. And we just measure that. It's as simple as that. To get a bit of an element out of here, we did multi-branch design. So we trained 2 AIs, for example, the image recognition. We just take the standard CNN, train it in, and learn the age. But one system we basically truncate in the training. So before early stopping really works. So one system is systematically worse than the other one. And so we expose some people to good AI predictors and some to not so good AI. Then we decided, shall we give you an explanation? So some people get no explanation. This is the AI says this. Value says the AI says this because in the case of the age, this, and this region are very important. That's the standard way of in the visual domain. We've done it also for tabular data in predicting the grades of students, but that's a separate story. And then the other thing is whether when we trained you in interacting with the AI, when you learned this game, whether you got the explanations from the AI. So if the AI was shaping your thinking, so to speak, or you simply got a sense of how good the AI is at predicting. And so that's 12 branches. That's why you want to put it on Amazon Turk. And so what I'm plotting you here is the absolute shift by how much people changed in any direction. And there's some, okay, so if you were exposed to the good AI in general, you trust more the AI because you shift more in the direction of the AI than if you're exposed to a poor AI. Fair enough? If I expose you to a good AI and a good explanation, oh, I've not said that word explanation. You can have a good explanation, you can have a bad explanation, or you can have a random explanation that has nothing to do with your sample. It's randomly sampled from another explanation. It didn't matter whether you had a good AI with a good explanation, a good AI with a poor explanation. Remember, this is somebody else's face that I give you the explanation for. The only impact that we saw is you have the good AI and I gave you no explanation. So any explanation made you follow. Okay, less trustworthy is if it's a poor AI with a good explanation. And the smallest shift was not surprising. If it's a poor AI system and gives you poor explanation, you just don't trust it from the outside. In fact, a poor explanation in this case was still better than giving no explanation. So the summary is we trust better predictors more. Great. we trust good prediction with explanation, irrespective how good the explanation was or whether it was even fitting. And the third one is we trust bad predictions with good explanations over bad predictions. And this is just for one of the explainability experiments. As I said, this is simply the feature importance on the base. We've done it also for tabular tasks. The results are hopefully coming in the next few days. But it is striking because, of course, we spend so much time in the XAI field to optimize that. But if any explanation works, then that's fairly incredible. And that's where I'm going to end. This is unpublished. We ran this experiment on 50 ICU clinicians that were actually given a patient record and a recommendation for the AI. And for the ICU clinician, we did one more thing. So you can have just the AI recommendation, the explainable AI recommendation that we have, or no explanation, just to see what the measure is. And then we showed them in the fourth branch, what have your peers done? And that is amazing. So if the distribution of the peers would have dosed is very narrow, people followed. If the peers were uncertain, people sometimes even went the opposite direction. And so that is a whole psychology of people going in there. But the interesting thing, the shift on the peers can be as strong as or stronger than any AI explanation. So, why should we do this? Oh, David did the same thing. Oh, then let me do what David does, right? And it's this human factor that we're often not accounting for when we're putting AI systems in the real world. And now I really should come to an end. I have an end slide somewhere here. So that's all. I'm just the guy who gives the PowerPoint presentation. So the Python people, there's a whole range of people. So Mayura does the clinical AI explainability. Ali has done the non-clinical explainability on Amazon Turk. And then we have a bunch of other. Lucien has done the VDPG algorithm work with me. And then Paul has done the decomposition of uncertainties.
Any questions?
Go for it.
On the slide with the Amazon Turk, did you see the good prediction and no explanation of that?
Let me go to that slide. So, good prediction and no explanation.
That has the largest shift.
That has the largest shift. I think we've done this branch, and I'm not sure if it's significantly different or not.
Right.
I need to check.
I agree that the book that came out in the economy about noise basically just talks about errors in the judgment.
Exactly.
Yeah, and like so to what extent are these sophisticated models any better than simple linear models? His main point is that the biggest benefit models give over humans is that they're modular and they don't change the prediction depending on the case.
They give you consistency across people.
Exactly.
Right. So that's the other thing. So we're planning a second round of experiments on Turk where we're trying to invite the old people back, and they're going to be confronted with some of the past decisions, because you can vary based on your daily form and based on your previous experience as well.
Yeah.
So I have a colleague at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and they looked at decisions for cesareans after a woman dies from cesarean section. And you can see, irrespective, in the same hospital, irrespective of the condition of the woman, there's no cesareans for a week post-death, and then it climbs up again, but it doesn't affect other hospitals. So, I mean, we're literally talking experiential psychology here in many ways. And so these human factors, I think it's interesting, to account for them. And yeah, but I think the key thing is that we use these shifts. In theory, you can use them to drive a gradient for improving an explanation algorithm. That's really why I wanted this.
What I was trying to say was you had a peer explanation, right?
Yeah.
So that in this situation, if peers have done this,
yeah,
might you have given an explanation saying, given your previous state, we can still say in another situation this hadn't occurred, we predicted such a thing, to try and reduce that half dependence of the decision. Sorry, I may have made myself clear, but essentially, can you make it so you compare this case to a very, very similar case in the past?
Correct.
Just tries to eliminate such bias.
Yeah. So just so we're clear, once you're in the POM-DP framework, you have a latent space where you have a representation of the patient. that is already a summary of the entire patient trajectory. And so you can now have patients that are very close by together. We call them digital cousins, and they're roughly the same. And we can then look, okay, what have other people done in the same setting? So that's how we actually generate the peer. Because of course, we don't have 100 doctors doing this exactly the same patient that situation. These were very similar patients in our latent phase, and we showed them the distribution of what doctors had done to that.
Could you do something where, let's say, also present the uncertainty in the AI decision. So the visible the AI decision is very broad. But I suspect, like when your peers are undecided as to what you should do, this is actually similarly could be to see when machines also very unclear, not decided by what you want to do. In the same way that might also decide to believe in AI.
Absolutely. And I think the crazy thing is, so because we did ICU data during the pandemic, I ended up running something which was the National Service Evaluation of Intensive Care Units. And so we got ICU data from British intensive care units live. And without going to detail, it's published. We were able to see basically there were clusters of policies that were depending on the hospital. And they were not always aligned with each other. And so it's this variation in practice that you see where sort of there's schools of thinking, or there's a thought leader and he says, let's do it that way. And they do. And then, we knew the two hospitals were very close because people were working in both. And so you could see that their policies were closer. But it's a whole story about using the framework of reinforcement learning to reverse engineer the human policy ultimately in some way. That sort of is an interesting insight.
Just one more follow-up question before going back to this. So when you gave an example before about machine says do X, right, to retention. So in some ways, the clinician can either accept or not accept that decision and do whatever they want. But ultimately, you're measuring maybe the benefit of reinforcement as to what actually the advice was. What you could imagine there is like the machine will start to learn. Well, look, for goodness sake, do this. You have to persuade even more aggressively the clinician to opt to do this particular action in order to get the human to actually carry that out.
Yeah.
And then you could learn a very, is that actually happening? Or...
So, okay, you're clearly an AI researcher. And, so this is, a lot of the AI clinicians deployment is funded by NIHR. So when you have NIHR money, you need to do patient integration and participation. So we actually present in a very simplified way the story to a group of patients and ask them what you think about that. And none of them wanted the AI system to persuade the doctor. And there's also, of course, a risk that the system could learn to maliciously persuade the doctor. I want that you do what I want, not because it's best for the patient necessarily, right? So we need to think about that. And I think the other interesting thing is, of course, such a system should ideally learn lifelong, right? You're working in the hospital, you're getting to learn. But that's not what the law allows us to do. The law tells us the moment we finish the development, we need to freeze the brain of this patient, and then it will forever act in the same way. That's like freezing the brain of a medical student. Say, you leave university, you cannot learn or change what you do. So that's one of the things that we're trying to change. Please. Oh, beautiful question. Okay. So, do I have a slide on that? So, okay, so the problem is the following thing. You have doctors doing things and we're learning retrospectively, right? So I cannot do something else to reinforcement learning. I don't have the option. And so this means that the optimal actions that you take may be very different from the ones that you observe. And so then it uses, so to speak, a state distributional shift. And there's a number of ways for dealing with that or trying to account for that. And one of that is basically a form of weighted importance sampling, where you're reweighting your policy's probability of choosing this action from the optimality perspective versus the behavior policies of the doctor and try to adjust for that. And there are a number of estimators that you can use to give you certain bounds on what to do. The trick is, or an interesting thing is, we tried a whole range of them, and Emma Brunskill has done a number of beautiful papers on evaluating or proposing these methods, that we then have effectively shown that the optimality is irrespectively maintained. But what you really need to do is this, the prospective testing on an actual patient. And so the way this currently runs in the ICU is that the system looks at what the doctors are doing, and then at the end of the week, we call that shadow mode. We confront the doctors, this is what the AI did. So there's no direct interaction. And then hopefully from May next year onwards, we will have a system that actually interacts with the doctor live at the patient. But there's a number of safety things that we need to do as well.
And try to understand it, like the ORM is a main model free sense there's some like planning taking place. Do you have a policy that's just given state action? Is there like early warning sort of functionality in these systems or systems plan ahead?
No, you need to do planning. Right, because the optimal policy is the total rollout value, right? But it's a distribution of values that you're getting, a distribution of optimal returns.
So you're training the model
Yeah.
Distribution policy.
Yeah.
When it comes to the rewards or the outcome, you basically, besides the mortality, what other outcomes are you use the objective sort of way to?
Yeah, so we've played with this. So one way of dealing with that is let's do inverse reinforcement learning and see what the doctors does may be the best reward function. And aside from the challenges, because it's a very dense system of transitions that you can get, is that so the inversion is very non-unique. You find actually that some of the maxima in the reward function of the doctors is not really optimal. It looks more like, oh, I just want that this guy doesn't die today while I'm on shift. It's less optimal in some ways. I'm making this up. Don't quote me as that a specific example. And then we asked, well, are there other intermediate goals? Maybe we need to stabilize the blood pressure, and then we need to do that. But that's, so to speak, not why I want to do machine learning. I want to get rid of human induction biases, right? But one thing that we were concerned about is that the AI system may make unsafe decisions. Pump 20 liters into the body. You have 7 liters of blood in your system. So that was clamped. But then we actually thought, can we define unsafe states or unsafe actions that are state dependent? And we spoke to many doctors, and it was completely unclear what unsafe actions were. So somebody said, "Oh, this cannot be more than 20," and then somebody said, "Well, but actually, if you had a heart attack and lung cancer, then yes, that's what we need to do." So we tried distilling out of human interviews an additional cost function that basically says how unsafe things are. And interestingly, it made the overall policy better to have, so to speak, risk safety factors built in. And we're trying to understand why that actually is, or if it's just constrained training more. But so we've done also an evaluation of safety critical systems that you don't usually do with reinforcement learning systems because they're sort of more mechanical. And they very much like this idea of inducing risk safety cost functions in the system. So this is just some of the things you can play with. Yeah?
This idea of comparing what a doctor will do to his peers, it's kind of an interesting price to you because they don't work in isolation, they work in shifts. So you take over the management of what was being done before. So your management may be different from what you would do de novo.
Absolutely.
It's influenced by what you were given.
Yeah.
So it could be that actually the biggest bias in all of this is what the first person seeing the patient starts off to.
And that's a beautiful question, because actually I asked to sit in some of these handovers because I wanted to know what bits of information are transmitted from A to B. But then you discover it's very anecdotal, and it's about I tell you a story why the grain price in Russia goes up or down, and sort of I give you my interpretation, and somebody tells you a slightly different story, but it's not consistent because it's a very amorphous state, right? And if you go back to the very start, I showed you a picture with states. So because we ran this with a clustering example at the very start, we tried different numbers of states, and we find that the optimality of the function peaked at 650 states. And that goes down to your point, because effectively, we get the best policies for a certain number of fixed states. in the old model, which was not continuous state. And that effectively means that there's a finite resolution under the assumptions of the model with which the clinicians make decisions about patients. And that's not because they don't care, it's you have a finite amount of bits of information that you can intake about the patient state in the time that you have. In 650 is not a large number, it's also not a small number, but it's quite interesting that that is the implied resolution that you get. And so there may be links between this finite resolution and the decision making that we then see.
I had a question. The slide about the Shapley guidance for the clinicians and the AIs. Yeah, which attributes are more important. I thought that was quite interesting in the sense that it seems like doctors focus more and more on specifics and they don't have like the capacity to worry so much. I was wondering about the relationship of this with the shift when you show the AI action.
Let's do some experiments. Just so you know, I'm looking for 4 postdocs at the moment, and we're in the second round of recruitment. So anyone interested in doing that, give me a shout.
I was wondering if psychologically there's any bias in the AI given a suggested action, or just given a summary of its own.
Okay, so I don't have the slide because we're still collecting the final patient doctor data. But on the 47 doctors that we showed this with, we asked them general questions to start about how do you feel about AI? You know, will an AI benefit humanity and so forth? Interesting thing, almost all doctors thought that AI will benefit them more than the rest of the people. But the other thing is exactly that. But we didn't find a strong dependence on how much people were positive about AI and whether they looked at AI recommendation. It was more sort of an anchoring. So either, you know, I don't like AI, but if the AI says so, then I will do so, because in a certain way it takes also responsibility away. And again, I'm not saying that that's what doctors are thinking for those that are watching the recording, but there's a whole set of processes happening. And when you put a Nobel Prize-winning doctor in intensive care next to you and he says, do this, that is a very heavy weight. And the question is how you're thinking about AI. If I would say, this is not an AI system trained on reinforcement learning, neurops, or whatever, but I say, oh, this is a box that makes decisions and it's wired in electronic cables, it would sound a lot less trust-inspiring, although it's the same thing. So I think we need to be also mindful as AI researchers, how much their whole cachet of AI may influence people. It's not necessarily how their attitude is, but how much they actually believe it carries responsibility.
Maybe the final question.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. So it's kind of related to David's point. So we talked a bit about like the trust shift when you add the explainability versus the good and the bad AI model. Does it matter how the suggestion from the AI is presented? Like for example, in the intravenous fluid example, let's say you say 500 milliliters of IV versus at like we're 80% confident that's a good value versus you fix confidence value and you just suggest a range like 300 to 500 milliliters. Because then the doctor's value is likely to be closer to that range and they might be more willing to follow an example, for example.
That's a wonderful question, and I will be able to tell you in a few weeks' time, because this looks like an ICU and this looks like a patient, but this is a dummy. And what is very standard in medicine that you have simulation rooms that look live and real. And so what we are running as of Tuesday, so yesterday, we are running a mock patients. And we put doctors here and we show the explanation on a screen and we give people eye trackers. So we actually see what they're paying attention to. And to get more into this, what's going on inside the human black box and make that explainable with respect to that. It's a small sample. We cannot, intensive care units are fairly busy, but we're getting a bunch of doctors and trying to get some purchase on what's going on in there.
Great. Okay, folks. Well, thanks.